In this episode of The Burning Archive, I am talking about China. And we ask the question, if America is an empire in decline, then is China the empire or great state that is on the rise? That is the question for today's Burning Archive. And I guess that brings us into our question that America seems increasingly to be an empire, not only an empire that is in decline, but an empire that knows it's losing its grip on global leadership and starting to act just a little bit erratically and a little bit unreliably as a result. In some ways, you could see the whole last 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency as a response of a section of the American political and business elite and of the American Republic realizing that America is in decline, that they needed to make America great again. And similarly, the effort to resist Donald Trump, whether legally or not legally, by whether it was, reasonable opposition or was it more covert undermining by people within the bureaucratic and military apparatus, intelligence apparatus of the American state, who really ought to have been following orders. That too was a rather insecure effort to cling on to this sort of global leadership. And with growing signs of the decline, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, soon followed by a counter-offensive by the Taliban, with gas shortage, petrol shortages in America, with pressure on its currency, with pressure on its trade deficit, with pressure on its diplomacy, with open contempt for its rules-based international order. There is this increasingly brutal reassertion of the American values-based global leadership, however much that might be a noble lie. And the challenger is clearly China. And this is driven by brute facts. China has grown from about less than 10% of world GDP to over 30% of world GDP. Well, approximately that. I can't really remember the exact numbers. It has probably achieved some level of technological leadership over the United States in some areas, and is aggressively pursuing technological leadership in artificial intelligence and biotechnology, perhaps weaponizing viruses as well, who knows. And there's military advantages as well, and then there's the sheer fact of a population that is increasingly educated, increasingly wealthy, and 3 or 4 times the size of America. It's kind of hard for America to keep China down for much longer, really, isn't it? And it's not only those brute facts, but it's also increasingly clear in what the protagonists, American and Chinese leaders and spokespeople, intellectuals, are saying. One example of this from the American side is a curious document called The Longer Telegram, published by the Atlantic Council. Now, the Atlantic Council is a kind of think tank supported by the American, diplomatic, security, military apparatus of, great and good figures in foreign policy and intelligence, over the decades, that publishes viewpoints and discussion papers and that sort of thing every now and then. And it recently published by an anonymous author this document called The Longer Telegram. And it has been speculated that the anonymous author is in fact Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, or if not him, then one of his senior staff. And The Longer Telegram's title is a reference to a long telegram published, I think, not published, but written, I think, in the late 1940s. Yeah, so the long telegram was written by an American diplomat, George Kennan, in 1946. And you can actually find this online quite easily. It's at the digital archive of the Wilson Centre. And in that, Kennan sort of outlines a strategy, the containment strategy for the Soviet Union that was largely followed through the Cold War after World War II, by which there was a self-confidence about the American system and an assessment that the Soviet system was too weak internally and would ultimately fall apart with its ideological approaches to things and its weak system and its weakness against the stronger West, bearing in mind America and Britain had been engaged in the civil war within Russia from about 1918. So the Atlantic Council and the anonymous author of the Longer Telegram is hearkening back, I guess, if you like, to this document, which became an intellectual foundation document for Cold War, and maybe summoning up the intellectual resources for a Cold War too. So it's quite pointed, I guess, that the Atlantic Council should call this the Longer Telegram, or perhaps unconsciously ironic as well, because the George Kennan's original telegram of 1946 is about 5 or 6 pages, I guess, and it's quite masterly in its succinctness. Back then, telegrams actually cost a bit of money, and the Longer Telegram is about 70 pages with a lot of consultant-style padding. So the real point is that in this document, the Longer Telegram, some think it was written by Anthony Blinken, but none of that has been confirmed. It says, the single most important challenge facing the United States in the 21st century is the rise of an increasingly authoritarian China under Xi Jinping. And let me just note, there's a bit of a qualification there. So it's not just China, it's China under Xi Jinping. But it goes on. China's growing national power across all these domains, by which it means security, military, commercial, financial, now challenges US global and regional dominance in a manner that the Soviet Union never did. America is worried. And rather like Kennan's telegram that argued for containment long enough for structural weaknesses in Russia to lead to regime collapse, this Longer Telegram punts on what it calls the long-standing bad emperor problem in China. So it seems the Americans are hoping for regime change in China. I guess good luck with that, but we shall see what happens. Now, on the other side, in China, they are equally clear that they're a rising power that needs a stronger platform in international affairs, and are increasingly assertive about saying so. So in the Global Times, which is a sort of online English language newspaper that is published by China, and it's largely seen as an unofficial outlet for the Chinese Communist Party, it published an editorial on the 6th of May 2021. So that's about 11 days ago. And it reads like the editorial, perhaps with some sort of ironic comment on the longer telegram and the evocation of America's success in defeating the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This editorial is entitled "No Way for Washington to Replicate Cold War Victory." And it reads, Hegemony, that is leadership, hegemony, is the lifeblood of the US, or dominance, I guess is another term for hegemony. The US is still the world's most powerful country in terms of comprehensive strength and has super dominance over the world. The problem with Washington is that it is too greedy. Its demands for hegemony, not an easy word to say, its demands for hegemony have gone far beyond its capabilities, and the US has fallen into an unprecedented sense of crisis and confusion. And the article goes on, the US greed for hegemony has caught it up in a difficult strategic overdraft. Many empires in history have experienced such quagmires. China and Russia have acquired some kind of initiative as they pursue their reasonable and controllable interests in a pragmatic manner. The US pressure on both China and Russia, as a matter of fact, has failed. So it's worth pointing out, I guess, first, that this is clearly a challenge, I guess, to the sense of confidence and that America always wins. But it's, I think, also worth pointing out that whereas the Atlantic Council and the American leadership is worried about the challenge of China, the Global Times, in fact, refers to two powers, China and Russia, and that they are in some kind of informal alliance, an informal alliance that is becoming more open and more explicit, that's outplaying the declining empire. And it says that perhaps by not seeing the world clearly, or still having this sentimental idea that America is the indispensable nation and the global leader and its word shall be law, it is committing strategic suicide, is the term that the Global Times use. So these two recent statements of opinion from the elites within both countries, China and America, I guess summarise the big theme of imperial rivalry quite well. China is on the rise, America is in decline, and they are both more and more aware of that, and including that more and more in their strategic calculations. And hence we've fully set the scene of the big theme that is one of the four big themes I've talked about in the podcast. That is, the four themes being imperial rivalry, cultural decay, political decay, and social fragmentation. So this first big theme that I've been addressing in this and the previous two podcasts of imperial rivalry has really been set the scene now. We have an empire in decline and at least one other empire on the rise, and growing conflict, rhetorical positioning and manoeuvring between them that is increasingly affecting everyone around the world and is perhaps leading to some kind of multipolar world that will change how we view international affairs and our own experiences of culture and everything else. But perhaps before jumping too much into that, maybe it's not unreasonable for me to at least ask the question of, is it fair to describe China as an empire? After all, I gave that question a fair go in episode 2 of the Burning Archive podcast. Is it really fair to say that this is a tale of an empire on the rise, or is this just a nation that is recovering its just place, so to speak, in world affairs and lifting itself and its people out of poverty? Or is China even seeking to replace America? Certainly there are American thinkers who think that. There's, the China hawks, I guess, within America see it as pursuing a long-term, like 100-year marathon type strategy to replace America as the global hegemon. But at least one People's Liberation Army, so military colonel from China, said in 2010 that China isn't aiming to be a global hegemon or an indispensable nation or, if you like, the dominant empire. It's only aiming to be an elder brother emperor. So, are we going to have sibling emperors here rather than rise and fall emperors? And is China even an empire? Is this term perhaps, even though we in an earlier podcast I said it's a reasonable term to use, maybe it's too loaded a term, too Western a term even to consider. Now, in a book by the, I think, Canadian historian Timothy Brook on China, Great State, China and the World by Timothy Brook, published in 2019, he makes the observation or the comment that there is a term in Chinese political thought or history, Da, or the Great State, that is frequently used or has been used for the Chinese Empire or the Chinese Great State since the 13th century. Initially, it was a term taken during the reign of Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan, the great Mongolian emperor who, of course, also controlled China. And in Mongolian, this term is Ikeulus, spelled Yekeules, and it described a state reaching out beyond its sort of more narrow confines and exercising dominion over others, what we would know as an empire. But every ruler since the 13th century in China has declared its regime to be such a great state. The Da Yuan, the Da Ming, the Da Qing. And Brook even makes the point that even the South Korean state is known as Daehon Minguk, or the People's Republic, the great state of the People's Republic of Korea. We know through Chinese history that it has claimed territories and exerted informal influence as much as the US. There's the Belt and Road Initiative, I guess, in recent times. But, the Ming Empire greatly expanded the borders of the Chinese Empire. And there are plenty of Chinese intellectuals who embrace empire. One such intellectual Jiang Shigong, who is I think a sociologist and a law professor, has written a significant essay called Empire and World Order, I think from around about 2008, that sort of time. And he's seen as a leading exponent or supporter of Xi Jinping thought. And he says this in his essay on Empire and World Order. And this quotation has a few echoes to some of my earlier discussion of how empire is, we can treat empire as a neutral conceptual term, not just a pejorative term. So, Shigong says, indeed, empire building and the competition between empires are what propelled mankind, sorry about the language, to move away from scattered local civilizations toward today's worldwide civilization under conditions of globalization. The history of the world is both a history of empires competing for hegemony and a history of the changing forms of empire. This is an important point I'm just interpolating there. At the present moment, the world finds itself at a crucial historical moment in the development and evolution of world empire, in quotation marks. Only by beginning from the perspective of empire and understanding the different forms empires assume as they evolve through history can we transcend the ideology of the sovereign nation state and understand the role that today's China is playing in the historical evolution of world empire, and thus chart a course for China's future. So Shigong essentially says that, yes, China is the world empire, and it will at some point seize control from within, so to speak, of the world empire that was pioneered first by England and then passed down to the child of the English child of the United States. And that in doing so, China will also evolve and develop the nature of that imperial system to be something different. And so what he is also saying is, let's not be fixated about nations and indispensable nations. Let's think more broadly about other forms of political entities like empires or evolving world empires that can provide a stable governance system for the world. Now, an interesting interlude here is Henry Kissinger. And now, Henry Kissinger, for those who don't know, was an American academic in the 1950s in international affairs. He studied the history of diplomacy in Europe and then became Secretary of State or Foreign Minister under Richard Nixon. And as such, he was really the key diplomat of some appalling things in the Vietnam War and the bombing of Cambodia and all that sort of stuff, some of which have led people to accuse him of being a war criminal, and perhaps not without some justification. But he was also, I guess, the key diplomat brokering the re-engagement with China, between America and China in the early 1960s. Sort of Nixon goes to China. So he has in recent years tried to forge a kind of diplomatic partnership between America and China that calls them both exceptional nations. America, they both have their own form of or thinking, mode of thinking or ideology, if you like, but mode of thinking that they are an exceptional nation. America being exceptional by means of its tradition of liberty and freedom and that sort of thing, and China equally having a sense of itself being exceptional through its cultural and demographic supremacy. And Kissinger really imagines himself, I guess, forging a marriage between these two exceptional nations. If you like, this is the whole chimerica thing, which was a term I think Neil Ferguson used to describe the partnership between China and America that people were trying to put together through the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and that is really broken down now in the open conflict between them. Now, I don't really buy Henry Kissinger's interpretation of things, but you should take it seriously. We should all take it seriously. I should also say, but he did meet Mao. He did talk with Zhou Enlai for many years, and he has been an informal advisor to every American president since Nixon. So that's since the late 1960s. And I guess he imagines a grand diplomatic marriage between two global giants, brokered by a great diplomat, rather like Henry Kissinger. But I guess my sense of it is that his vision of the future is very much steeped in Kissinger's life as a grand statesman and his study of European diplomacy, his vision of world order after the creation of the Westphalian system of nation states. And I'm not sure that vision really fits the evolution of China's role in the world or the international system post-American empire. So I think we probably need to look at some alternative historical metaphors or models to think about how China might follow America as the dominant empire or another large and influential dominant empire in the world. But I think there is one thing in particular, though, to be clear on in Chinese about Chinese history, and I was going to sort of have a crack at doing a 10-minute summary of Chinese history, but I'm just not sure. I might do that another time. But one of the really important things to be aware of is that from the from the 1840s through to 1949, which was the year of the Chinese Revolution and the coming to power of the Chinese Communist Party in China. Those years are generally known in China as China's century of humiliation. The 1840s really begins with the Opium Wars, where rather ignominiously the British Empire forced upon China importation of opium, which in fact China had prohibited well before Prohibition in America in the 20th century, for the drug policy experts out there. But so that century was a dark period in Chinese history. So there's the Opium Wars, which force opium onto a large proportion of the Chinese population when the Chinese imperial elite were trying to control its use and prevent sort of all the bad side effects of widespread drug abuse. It also forced open greater commercial exploitation of China. It forced upon China the port treaties, which it often refers to, so then we talk about Macau and Hong Kong and to some degree also Taiwan. And then it was followed by an extraordinary civil war, the Taiping Rebellion, which I think like the war that's the greatest loss of life in human history, and is a whole story in itself, which I might come to in another podcast episode. A truly extraordinary story. And the decay and collapse of the Qing Empire, which ultimately fell in 1911, and then its invasion by Japan and growing sort of exploitation by the Western powers, including both Britain and America. So that's the whole century of humiliation, which in many ways the Chinese state is seeking to reverse. I almost wonder whether it's seeking to inflict the same century of humiliation on America. And over at my blog, theburningarchive.com, you can read a article or a post I wrote there, 6 or so months ago, called America's Coming Century of Humiliation. Yeah, America's Coming Century of Humiliation. In fact, I've sort of reposted this back in March 2021. And yes, I feel that is possibly what is going on in the conflict between China and America. But if I just return to my main point. So our main point here is to say, and it goes back to the whole discussion last time about decline stories are ways of telling a story. They're sort of encoded narratives where you frame the historical experience in a certain way. They are simplifications, if you like, or stories, but truthful simplifications. But we should at least think about how they are not always fully right. And I want to talk about 4 ways of looking at a contest between empires that might help us see how the current imperial rivalry between America and China might play out, and might play out differently than just a simple America declines and falls, collapses, and China rises and becomes the new top dog. So the first metaphor is the Thucydides trap. Now, this is a way of describing the relationship between these two empires that was put by an American academic / strategic studies consultant, Graham Allison. His book from 2017, which I just seen here, has on the front cover a quote from Joe Biden. Allison is one of the keenest observers of international affairs around. In Destined for War, he lays out one of the defining challenges of our time. There you go. It's got a recommendation from Joe Biden. Not surprisingly, I'm not going to regard this book very highly. But anyhow, there we go. So in his 2017 book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Allison talks about the historical metaphor of rise and fall of empires, of Athens and Sparta as described by the Greek historian Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars, from about whatever it was, I don't know, the 3rd century before Christ, or before the contemporary era. And let me just quote, and that is essentially the challenge of how a dominant power responds to a rising power, and how they manage the fear that they feel, the dominant power's fear that it feels, with the growing strength and assertiveness of the rising power. And what Thucydides said was that it was the fear of the rising power that led to war. So Allison says, today China has awakened and the world is beginning to shake. Yet many Americans are still in denial about what China's transformation from agrarian backwater to the biggest player in the history of the world means for the United States. What is this book's big idea? In a phrase, Thucydides' trap. When a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, alarm bells should sound. Danger ahead. China and the United States are currently on a collision course for war, unless both parties take difficult and painful actions to avert it. So that's the Thucydides trap. Sparta or Athens, I can't quite remember which, sees the other one growing, is dominant. I think it's Sparta sees Athens growing, and in fear it puts the clamps down and tries to, it provokes military action against Athens to contain it. And Allison produces what he describes as a case file, the Thucydides trap case file, with 16 examples of a ruling power and a rising power, where the conflict happened and what the result was. And he finds in all but 4 of those cases, they led to war. It's a pretty narrow field. It really just covers Europe, with 1 or 2 exceptions. Europe from the late 15th century to the 1990s. And some of them are a little bit dodgy, like the United Kingdom and France versus Germany for political influence in Europe. But we'll just let that be. So that's his metaphor. I don't really totally agree with this, but I'm not going to dwell on it too much. As I said, I think it's a pretty limited set of examples that he's talking about. And there are some other ways of thinking about it. One of the other ways, so this is the second of 4 ways that we're going to look at in terms of historical metaphors, is Cold War II. And this is a term that historian Neil Ferguson, who's I think whose voice featured on the second episode of the Burning Archive podcast. Cold War II is the idea that what we are now in with China and America is a replay or a sequel to the Cold War that happened between Russia or the Soviet Union and America, the United States, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Well, yeah, I guess the 80s, finished in 89 when America won the Cold War. So Neil Ferguson has set out this sort of view around the China-America situation in a number of books, but in his most recent book, Doom, which is sort of provoked by the pandemic, he talks about the situation between China and America. And he writes this: "It is not up to us whether," and us, of course, by which he means America, but anyhow, he's Scottish, but he's writing largely for an American audience. "It is not up to us whether or not we have a Cold War with China. If China has already declared Cold War on us, not only are we already in the foothills of that new Cold War, those foothills are also impenetrably covered in a dark forest of China's devising." Now, you could say there is some validity, I guess, to this. Well, certainly there is some validity to this metaphor. It's illuminating in some ways. There is a difference in the political systems between China and America that is playing out for global dominance and, I guess, regions of spheres of influence across the world. And there is many spectrums of conflict, of information warfare and cyber warfare and, competition for the hearts and minds of both elites and the publics in the different world that is without there being direct military kinetic conflict between between China and America at the moment. So in that respects, there is that similarity of the relationship between Russia or the Soviet Union and America that prevailed in the Cold War. No direct conflict, lots of proxy wars, lots of satellite states, lots of ideological conflict over capitalism versus socialism sort of thing, capitalism versus communism. And there is that some of that same ideological and non-traditional warfare dimension to what is going on at the moment. But I think there's also many differences as well. Not least, the Cold War is to some degree the aftermath of World War II. World War II is to some degree a conflict between Germany and Russia, in which Russia lost 25 million people and largely defeated Germany. It paid for the blood, and then America came in and took the treasure, sort of thing. And so I think in many ways it's also quite a different scenario. There is some sort of ideological conflict, but there's not the same fundamental difference over economic system. China does not really run a planned economy in the same way that the Soviet Union did. It largely runs a state capitalist market economy and has gone very well with many of the elites. So there are some similarities, some differences. But it's interesting too, if we harken back to that Global Times editorial and the Atlantic Council longer telegram, that metaphor of the Cold War is also playing out in the elites' heads there. They are thinking, okay, this is Cold War II, so how did we win Cold War I? Well, we sort of, defended freedom and ultimately the weaknesses of the rival system collapsed. Whereas China is saying, well, no, America, this time you're fighting a unified China and Russia, and you will not be able to impose your alliance system across the whole world because the rest of the world is going to have too many important connections with China and Russia to sort of divide the world up into two big blocks. So that's the second historical metaphor that is sort of illuminating and sort of not about China v Russia. The third one, and there's no source for this one, this is just one I made up in reading something the other day, but interestingly, the late or East Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, that was centred around Constantinople from about 300 AD to 1453. It was through the Middle Ages, I guess, the dominant power in Europe in many ways. It had its ups and downs, of course, and it had a great conflict with Islam and the Arab sort of caliphates post 700 or so. But it was within its region of influence a dominant power, and it had a interesting rise versus rule, to use Graham Allison's term. Interesting relationship with a rising power of Venice, and Venice was a great commercial power that in a way sort of slowly sort of insinuated itself into the commercial and political elites of Byzantium and its commercial systems, and slowly sort of operated in a almost parasitical sort of relationship to the the prestige empire, but profiting off it. And I do wonder whether there is an element of this that is interesting for China and the Byzantine, the comparison between China and America. Because China has very successfully gained commercial influence in America. It has a huge trade surplus with America. It has holds huge amounts in foreign currencies. It has a very strong influential role with financial and business elites who are, desperate to have access to the Chinese market. And the story around Venice and Byzantium was that at some point the Byzantine Empire was not paying its debts. And in around about 1024 or 1200 or something like that, I just don't have the date with me, but related to the Crusades and the sort of reassertion of cultural influence of the Byzantine Empire in that region. Venice basically, tricks the Byzantine Empire, says it will participate in the Crusades, but really goes to Constantinople and reclaims its debts and sacks the great city. And it's an act of piracy, you could almost say, or a predatory act that the Byzantine Empire never really fully recovered from, and which Venice has to this very day still benefited from. So many of the famous cultural icons of Venice are in fact effectively loot from that sacking of Byzantium, including, I think, some of the statues and the artwork in many of the great buildings of Venice. So that story, that historical metaphor, the third historical metaphor of Venice and Byzantium, I guess is a story of how rising and ruling can also be a story of parasite and host, or predator and complacent and somewhat less agile victim. And it's also a reminder that empires don't always fall absolutely. They can crumble very, very slowly. I mean, the Byzantine Empire, after that devastating loss, continued on for 400 years, 200, 300, 400 years. I'm just a bit vague on the dates at this point. And they can survive in a diminished form. So they don't necessarily collapse, but they can survive in a diminished form. And I do wonder whether what we're seeing with America now is some of that. The people are going to sort of move in and claim their loot, and the empire will sort of carry on, but in a much, much diminished and crumbling form. Now, the fourth and final historical metaphor, is about Napoleon and the concert of Europe. So in the in the 1790s, after Napoleon comes to power and after the French Revolution, Napoleon effectively conquers most of Europe, and in doing so also takes over Spain, which means he becomes the controller of the Latin American Empire, which then sort of, disintegrates, I guess. And it's a empire partly born in ideas, like the American Republic, of equality and freedom and liberty, and also that exports many of its systems to large parts of Europe. The sort of Napoleonic legal system was exported to huge amounts of Europe as a result of the conquest of those countries by Napoleon. But ultimately, Napoleon overreaches. He invades Russia and is defeated by Russia, memorably retold in the story of War and Peace, of course, by Tolstoy. And the Great Congress of Vienna in 1814 or 1815, which is the negotiation of the peace after the collapse of the Napoleonic ideological empire. Let's just describe it that way to draw an analogy with the American world empire. Is the peace that's brokered by all the European powers in this great diplomatic festival of the Congress of Vienna is described as the Concert of Europe. And effectively what that is a balance of power between the five great powers of Europe: Russia, France, England, Austria, and I think the sort of German states are somehow represented in there as well, the Habsburgs or whatever. So that's another way in which an empire collapses and retreats to become a nation, France, and rather than a single dominant empire replacing it, at least within Europe, you have something of a balance of power between multiple centres, if you like, a multipolar world. And it does seem to me that, again, this is another example that we're not necessarily going to see rise and fall of one dominant empire and then the same old story again. It's who's going to be the dominant empire. It may well be that we evolve into a different kind of system where there is a more polycentric world, a more subtle and complicated institutional arrangement in terms of international affairs. Certainly at the moment we do seem to be at a pivot point in the international system, and one where both the unipolar world of America as a hyperpower and the 300-year history of Anglophone empires are being challenged. And I think that is going to really set the scene for many discussions along the way on this podcast. And it's possible also that the multipolar world will reverse centuries of cultural convergence. Globalization doesn't have to be Americanization. Ever since Europe broke out from its peninsular fortress in the 16th century or 15th century, we have been on a strong trend towards global convergence in many ways, as cultures have sort of formed and sort of, I guess, followed more and more a single model. But if the American empire crumbles and others develop in turn, we might see a reversal of that trend. On the other hand, we might see the situation that Jiang Qigong seems to, the Chinese intellectual I quoted earlier, who wrote about world order and empire, he seems to imagine an inner capture of a world empire. So a Chinese, a Sinocentric world empire, making the 21st century the Chinese century, in the same way that the 20th century was described by some as the American century. Who knows? Anyhow, Jiang Qigong has some very interesting reflections in that essay, which I think I might even return to in another podcast as I continue to develop this theme of imperial rivalry.